Chapter 16. One afternoon, Flora and I were restringing our ukuleles on the back steps when Papa drove up and began wrestling a large box out of the back seat of his car. We followed him into the house asking questions, but he only whistled mysteriously. Mama was mystified too, but managed to make her usual remarks about fire sales. Papa was in his usual before-the-fact euphoria. This is an historic occasion, too historic for trivialities. He set about tearing off the strips of lumber and getting sawdust on the floor. Mama ventured, "Isn't that the kind of work that should be done in the basement?" "No, Mama. This is the kind of work I bought you a vacuum cleaner for." Mama fetched the vacuum cleaner, and before she could untangle the cord, Papa had set the big box thing with knobs and dials on the library table and was reading the instruction book. We concluded that maybe he didn't know what the darn thing was himself. Dor observed, "It looks like a clock that can't tell time." "What good is a clock that can't tell time?" I asked. Fleur ignored me. "It's not a clock, and I don't think it's a dishwasher either." "Of course not, dummy. We already have a dishwasher," I said. "And our dishwasher can't tell time either," Dor said. "Of course not, dummy. Dishwashers aren't supposed to tell time." "No, and they're not supposed to mangle all the forks either," Dor said. "I guess it's just for decoration," we concluded. "It can't be for decoration," Mama said, "because—" Papa now had his tools out. He drilled a hole in the window casing, threaded some wires outside, and climbed up and down a ladder carrying hammers, screwdrivers, and other complicated-looking objects. Sometimes he climbed all the way up to the roof. Mama got bored and went to the kitchen. Flora and I got back to our ukuleles. Finally, Papa called out, "The historic occasion has arrived." We all gathered around. Papa's first order of business was to warn us about the consequences of touching the knobs and dials. We shuddered. It sounded as gruesome as sticking our hands out the open grating of the elevator in Papa's office building. Papa ceremoniously clicked some knobs, which made the hands on the dials begin jumping around like crazy. We heard squeaks and squawks. "That sounds worse than the old strings on our ukuleles," I said. Finally, we heard a voice. "It's like a telephone," Fleur exclaimed. "How can we answer back?" I asked. Papa was losing a measure of his before-the-fact euphoria. "That's the nice thing about it, Franny, you can't answer back." We heard music. "It's like our phonograph," Dor said. "Yeah, it's kind of like a phonograph, but you don't have to wind it up," Papa said. "How do we change the records?" "There aren't any records," Papa said. "You mean we have to listen to that same squeaky record all the time?" I said. Fleur piped up. "It sounds like Dor singing." "It'll take some further adjusting," Papa said. The news swept through the neighborhood. The Bigham household has a radio. Papa invited the neighbors in and positioned himself at the controls like a captain on a ship. The men, who knew about such things, showed great admiration. The women who didn't know about such things sat back, hoping that it wouldn't explode. Finally, Papa turned the knob. Out came the squeaks and squawks. Everybody clapped and said, "Isn't that amazing?" I tried very hard to appreciate the thing, but I really didn't. Personally, I preferred phonographs and ukuleles, even if we had to wind them up. Fleur said, "You don't have to wind up a ukulele, dummy." I took Fleur's ukulele and loosened all the pegs. "Now you have to wind them up, dummy." After a year of squeaks and squawks, Papa bought a new radio and told Mama she could crate up the old set and send it to Mother. "What's he got against Mother?" Fleur asked. Much to our amazement, the new set sounded much better. Papa explained that it was electrified, which to us meant that we could keep it going all day. We girls learned to operate it, which wasn't all that complicated. All one had to do was turn the dial. We girls loved listening to popular songs and a children's program called Storyland Court. The announcer began, "What little earth child in the charmed land has not heard the call of Storyland, which comes each evening to the homes of those who have magic boxes?" From far and near, the Storyland Court fairies gather to entertain those who tune their magic box to KOMO. Ruled by the beloved Queen of Storyland, Dorothy Denny Snowden, and obliging King Hubert Godfrey from the neighboring state of Biloland. We were enthralled. "Are there really fairies?" Dor asked. I knew we were trying to retain Dor's belief in Santa Claus, so, even though I wasn't convinced myself, I assured her, "Of course there are fairies, dummy. Can't you hear 'em singing on the magic box?" Papa was bewildered. "What's this about fairies?" "Go look it up in the dictionary," Dor said. She could afford to be sassy, as she hadn't yet been required to join the dictionary fraternity. However, Papa felt it was time for her to pay some dues. "Dorothy, you go and look it up in the dictionary. It's spelled F-A-I-R-Y. Franny, you go along and help. That was the story of my life, always having to pay for Dorothy's sins. I did all the work and Dor got all the glory. She reported back, fairies are little guys that aren't really real, and they play tricks and are naughty and frisky and... From then on, Dor began begging. Can we go to KOMO someday and see the fairies and the Queen of Storyland Court and the King from Bilo Land? Mama made arrangements for our visit. Dor could hardly wait. What do you suppose it's really like, Franny? Remember the Olsen and Johnson show? All the funny guys? And the fluffy dresses that didn't hardly cover the ladies' bottoms? Dor had a good memory. Yep, it'll be like that and even better. Fairies will be floating around in the air. And will the queen be dressed in a beautiful dress, like in Mama's closet? It'll be more beautiful than anything we've ever seen. Boy, oh boy. The minute we entered the broadcasting studio, I felt uneasy. Fleur confirmed my mood. This doesn't look like Bilo Land to me. We were ushered to the most uncomfortable chairs I ever sat on, except for our camp stools, but I didn't speak out because half a dozen people who looked more like gorillas than fairies were wagging their index fingers, saying, "Shush." Dor began. This doesn't look like... I clapped my hand over her mouth. Shush! A gorilla person scowled at me. Shush! Across the room from us sat a row of children who looked like they had been told that the last dish of ice cream had just been sent to the poor children of Abyssinia. They were being shushed too. Then we saw the most ridiculous thing. Behind a big window sat big people with earmuffs on. Yes, earmuffs. I was totally perplexed. It sure wasn't cold in here. In fact, it was hot. My expectations were crumbling fast, but I still clung to the hope that Queen Dorothy Danae would come floating in, wave her wand, and suddenly everything would change into a fairyland. Instead, green and red lights began flashing, and a familiar voice came from somewhere up in the ceiling. What little earth child in the charmed land has not heard the call of Storyland? Dor had started to cry. I was going to clasp my hand over her mouth, but I felt, to heck with it. This is the biggest hoax ever played on little children. So why not cry? I did, and everybody said, shush. By this time, an awkward kid was standing up to the only thing that was floating in the air. And it wasn't a fairy. It was a little contraption that looked like the hubcap on Mama's Buick. The voice in the ceiling said, and now, we have little fairy Danny Dooley. A weary-looking man thumped some keys on the piano, and the kid began singing. Dor whispered, that isn't Fairy Danny Dooley. Of course not. We had seen a picture of Fairy Danny Dooley on a folder, and he had big wings and feelers on his head, but it had to be Danny Dooley, because he was singing Danny Dooley's song, a garbled ditty that Papa said was Scotch. The farce continued, fairy after fairy. Dor and I were getting sick of it. Even Fleur's freckles looked sick. Then suddenly, the lights stopped flashing. The guys behind the window pulled their earmuffs off. The fairies jumped up and ran around like a bunch of hoodlums, and a lady in a fairy costume, a fake fairy if I ever saw one, was passing out candy. I held out my hand, but the fake fairy grumbled, little children first. Dor stepped forward and grabbed a whole handful, and the fake fairy stomped on down the line. Dor gave me 3 pieces, which were all sticky because her hand was wet from crying. Then I heard, calling the big ham girls to audition. I was horrified, but Mama began herding us to the piano. She handed the gypsy love song to the piano player, who began playing the introduction at twice the speed that Mama always played it. Fleur began singing the alto part alone, while I tried to get the candy out of my teeth, and Dor laid down by the stew pot, even though we hadn't brought the stew pot. That evening, Papa inquired about our visit, and Fleur said, if that was Bilo Land, I don't ever want to go to the North Pole. Yeah, we'd probably find out that Santa Claus doesn't have a white beard, I said. Mama complained that the pianist had played prestissimo. Papa said, that's probably because he belongs to the musicians' union and only had a few minutes left on his shift. Dor was still sticky from the candy. How come big people are always trying to trick little kids? I was wondering that too. Do we have to go through life always being told some pretty story and then find out later that it wasn't true? After that, I was blamed for Dor no longer believing in Santa Claus. Surprisingly, Mama got a call from KOMO. And then, as if by the sudden wave of a magic wand, actually it was one of those newfangled fountain pens, Florence, Frances, and Dorothy were transformed into Dixie, Dido, and Duddlebug, fairies of Storyland Court. Papa said, so now when I introduce you, I'm going to have to say, these are my Pacific Coast fairies. Dixie was born in California, Dido was born in Oregon, and Doodlebug was born in Washington. Another funny story that wasn't true, I thought. Naturally, I didn't like my name. "What's a dido?" I complained. The minute the words were out, I knew I had made a mistake. Soon I reported back from the dictionary. "I'm the Queen of Carthage who stabbed herself." "Gee, that's weird," Fleur said. "Where's Carthage?" Without even a trip to the dictionary, Mama said, "Carthage was a Phoenician colony on the coast of North Africa that ruled the Mediterranean world until it was conquered by Rome in 150 BC. We were all amazed, but we shouldn't have been. Mama often came up with evidence of her book learning. "I wrote a theme on the Punic Wars in high school," she explained. "What has a queen that killed herself got to do with fairies?" I asked. No one answered me because Fleur was explaining to Papa, "We're not allowed to sing the current hit tunes or any songs we already know." Papa was indignant. "You mean they can't sing my songs? Why can't they sing my songs?" Mama looked stern. "Because your songs are frisky and naughty." Papa began to click off the songs he had taught us that he thought should be appropriate, since they weren't frisky and naughty. "Sidewalks of New York, Bicycle Built for Two, My Merry Oldsmobile. In the Good Old Summertime, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, My Wild Irish Rose, Peg O'Neill, When Irish Eyes Are Smiling," Mama interrupted. "Not everyone is Irish, Papa." "You're right, Mama, some people are Scotch." He began again. "The Bluebells of Scotland, Annie Laurie, Coming Through the Rye." Mama shook her head. "They probably have enough Scottish songs, what with Danny Dooley and his Scotch brogue." "My gosh, what kind of songs do fairies sing then?" Papa asked. We knew the answer because Mama had bought a new songbook and played a few examples. "They sing songs about tender little flowers," Fleur replied. "And sweet little animals in the woodland," I added. "And frogs," Dor said. She was learning a song about a frog. "And we don't like dumb songs about tender little flowers and sweet little animals in the woodland and frogs," we all said. "I suppose this will keep you busy making fairy costumes," Papa said to Mama. "No, fairies can't be seen on the radio, so they don't have to be in costume," Fleur said. "At least fairies get to play their ukuleles, I hope," Papa presumed. That was correct. This matter had been discussed, and thought it was conceded that fairies customarily played flutes. It would be quite impossible to play the flute and sing at the same time. Besides, we didn't have flutes. We had ukuleles. Thus began our careers as fairies on Storyland Court. We didn't enjoy singing into the hubcap as much as singing to an audience, but Mama was happy and kept us learning new songs. She enjoyed being at the studio. She enjoyed the people, especially Miss Snowdon, the queen of Storyland Court. Miss Snowdon often asked if Little Duddlebug didn't have a song that she could sing by herself. Mama assured her that she was working with Duddlebug, and, hopefully soon, she would. The fact was that Mama was not having much success. Duddlebug's voice was sounding more like Mama's every day. When Mama learned that Miss Snowdon, a lovely and poised lady, gave singing and drama lessons, she signed us up immediately. Our lessons began with breath control. Holding herself at the diaphragm, Miss Snowdon intoned, "A-E-I-O-U, do not take a breath." We held ourselves at the diaphragm and chirped along right behind, "A-E-I-O-U, do not take a breath." Without losing a beat, she corrected us. "Do not say do not take a breath. Only I say do not take a breath. You say A-E-I-O-U. Only." "A-E-I-O-U. Only," we repeated. After our exercises, we recited our little poems. "Dixie," Miss Snowdon called us by our fairy names, "you will be the first." Dixie had a piece called Borrowed Feathers by Joseph Morris. It was about a rooster who pulled out his tail feathers and replaced them with peacock feathers. Ultimately, though, through trial and error, he found out that his own simple feathers were best. A rooster one morning was pruning his feathers, that glistened so bright in the sun. No, Dixie, not pruning. The word is preening. That means smoothing them out with his beak. I envied Fleur's, or Dixie's that is, lengthy poem, and didn't think it necessary for Miss Snowdon to interrupt her all the time. Pruning, preening, who cares? The problem was, when Dixie was interrupted, she had to go back to the beginning and start over again. She did this about 50 times a day, and everyone in the Bigham household could recite the first 2 lines of Borrowed Feathers in their sleep, but we all said pruning instead of preening. I liked for Dixie to get to the moral at the end, and figured that pruning was the right word after all. Miss Snowdon very politely inferred that I should not be worrying about others' poems. I should be worrying about my own. Mine was simply awful, the kind of thing one would expect a Dido to recite, something about whims of winged fantasy. It never made any sense to me, and I couldn't memorize it. I felt cheated, and longed to boom out some pithy moral for other people to live by. Miss Snowdon said she had picked it for me because I had a sensitive nature. I didn't believe it. I had come to suspect that sensitive nature was something people came up with when they couldn't think of something nice to say about you. In answer to Miss Snowdon's comment, I told Mama, she doesn't like me because I have a Roman nose, and that's why she called me Dido. Mama said that was not true, and that I didn't have a Roman nose. Then why does everyone in class call me Nero? That was true. Some of the kids had seen a likeness between me and a picture in our history books of the Roman emperor who had played the violin while Rome burned. Mama had to concede that I did have a rather high bridge. But you should be proud. It's classical. But Mama, classical is not in style. Papa and Joe Bowen had discussed my classical nose at one time, and if I remember right, Joe proposed that I had inherited a strain of Roman blood somewhere back in my ancestry. Papa said, well, you're wrong there. Fran inherited it when she ran into a mailbox. Duddlebug, of course, had a meaty piece too. It was called Be the Best of Whatever You Are, by Douglas Mallock. Miss Snowdon had explained that all 16 lines of the poem were building up to the finale, the same words as the title. After Duddlebug had learned the poem, she felt there was not much point in wasting time. The ending was what mattered, after all, so she would sing prestissimo right up to the last line. Then, with diaphragm visibly expanded, she would beseech, be the best of whatever you are. Unfortunately, when Dor put too much pressure on her vocal cords, they rebelled, so it was never the grand finale Miss Snowdon hoped for. She and Mama still had hope, however,